It's a little after 3 in the morning on Christmas Day, 1974. You're lying on the floor of your bathroom in Darwin, Australia, with a mattress pulled over the top of you, and your husband is bleeding from the back of his head onto the tiles. Your 2-year-old son is wedged between your legs. He hasn't made a single sound in over an hour. You can't see anything. The power went hours ago. Every now and then a flash of lightning lights up the room through where the ceiling used to be, and you catch a glimpse of the fridge from your kitchen flying past your back garden like it weighs nothing. The walls are doing something you have never seen walls do before. They are breathing in and out like a chest, like the whole house is alive and trying to hold itself together, and failing. The sound is the worst part. People who lived through it later struggled to describe it. They said it was a freight train, a fighter jet. One woman called it a screaming banshee. A priest called it the screaming of souls. None of them think those words are big enough. By the time the sun comes up, 70% of every house in Darwin will be gone. An entire Australian capital city with a population of 47,000 people is about to be wiped off the map in a single night. And almost no one outside the Northern Territory has any idea it's happening. This is the story of Cyclone Tracy. Act 1. The town before. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what Darwin was. In December of 1974, Darwin was the strangest little capital city in the developed world. About 43,000 people lived there, give or take, scattered across 12,000 houses on a hot peninsula 3,000 kilometres from anywhere that mattered. To get to Adelaide, you drove for 3 days. To Sydney, you flew for 5 hours. The city had one deep water port, one international airport, one hospital, one daily newspaper, and a population that turned over by about a quarter every 12 months. People mostly came up for the wages, stayed for the lifestyle, and left when the wet season broke them. It was a frontier town pretending to be a capital. Houses were built fast and built cheap, mostly timber frames on steel stilts clad in fibro sheeting, roofed with corrugated iron, with louvre windows that you cranked open to catch whatever breeze came off the harbour. The Institution of Engineers had warned, just months earlier, that most Darwin homes would not survive a serious cyclone. Nobody listened, because nobody wanted to. The houses were what people could afford. And anyway, when had Darwin ever copped a serious one? The last bad cyclone was in 1937. People had stopped worrying about it. The wet season was just starting. 30 degrees, 90% humidity, and people doing what Northern Australians do in late December. Drinking cold beer in singlets and stubbies. Planning Christmas Day feasts. Kids riding their dragsters up and down streets called Gardenia and Kalimnos, daring each other to skid on the loose gravel. Mums loading the frigid air with prawns and pavlova. Dads arguing about whether the cricket would be on the wireless at lunchtime. Look at the houses. Single story. Big breezeways underneath. Hibiscus and frangipani in the front yards. The smell of mosquito coils and a neighbour's dog asleep under a Holden ute. Christmas trees made of green tinsel because the real ones wilted in the heat. Carols on the radio that nobody really sang along to because it was too hot to sing about snow. Up the road in Wagaman, an Italian family called the Gonzalvezes was finishing dinner. The dad was watching the sky and didn't like the look of it. He'd seen storms back home in Italy, but the green tint in the cloud that night was something new to him. In Stuart Park, a kid called Roland was helping his old man pull the shutters down on the family general store, the Tank store, where they'd been serving cold drinks all afternoon to people doing their last-minute shopping. In Nightcliff, a young Canadian woman called Gail Hannon, who'd come out for a working holiday and fallen in love with Darwin, was getting ready for bed. She was 20 years old. She figured she'd ride out whatever this was. And out at HMAS Arrow, the Navy base, a 21-year-old Ran called Judith Rowe was on watch. She was meant to be house-sitting for some friends that night, and she'd grumbled about copping the duty roster. The friend's house she was supposed to be in would be flattened to the ground by morning. The duty roster saved her life. That was Christmas Eve in Darwin in 1974. A drowsy, sweaty, slightly drunk evening in the most isolated capital city on Earth. Children in bed by 9, adults trying to stay up for midnight mass. A few thousand parties going on at once. And out in the Arafura Sea, about 370 kilometres to the north, a small thing was getting bigger. Act 2. The storm that wasn't coming. The first warning came almost a week before. On the 20th of December, a US weather satellite spotted a cloud mass over the Arafura Sea. By the next night, a senior meteorologist at the Darwin Bureau of Meteorology, a man called Jeff Crane, had named the system Tracy. The naming convention at the time worked through alphabetical lists of women's names, and Tracy was the next one up. For 3 days, Tracy did what most cyclones in that part of the world do. She spun gently to the southwest, parallel to the coast, looking for all the world, like she was going to drift past Darwin and dissolve out over the Indian Ocean. The Bureau told the public there was no immediate danger. ABC Radio Darwin ran the warning hourly, but the wording was reassuring. People had heard it all before. Just 2 weeks earlier, a different cyclone called Selma had been forecast to hit Darwin, and Selma had fizzled into nothing. Cyclone fatigue was real even before the word existed. Then, on the morning of the 24th, Tracy did something she wasn't supposed to do. She turned 90 degrees, not gently, not over the course of a day. She rounded Cape Fourcroy on the western tip of Bathurst Island and pivoted hard straight toward the city. The Bureau saw it on radar. They watched the eye reform. They watched it sharpen and tighten, and they saw it set its track, and they realized sometime around lunchtime on Christmas Eve that they had a major problem. There's a quote from one of the journalists who was at ABC Radio that day. His name was Richard Creswick, and he remembers the head of the Bureau, Ray Wilkie, asking him to be careful with his wording on the next bulletin. "Don't over-dramatize it," Wilkie said. "Don't scare the population." It's a phrase that has haunted Creswick for 50 years, because the population by then needed to be scared. The population needed to get into a brick toilet block and stay there. The 12:30 warning went out. Very destructive winds expected tonight and tomorrow. Hourly broadcasts began. Loudspeaker trucks started doing the rounds in some of the northern suburbs, telling people to batten down. But it was Christmas Eve. Pubs were still open. People were already a few schooners deep. The kids were wired on red cordial and Christmas cake. The Christmas tree was lit up in the lounge room, and Father Christmas was due in about 6 hours. Most people heard the warning. Most people just didn't believe it. Selma was still fresh in everyone's memory, and Selma had been a non-event. So they had another beer. They put another sausage on the barbie. The kids went to bed, and the wind kept getting stronger. By 8 o'clock that night, Darwin's power was flickering. By 9, half the city had lost it altogether. By 10, the rain wasn't falling anymore. It was being thrown sideways at 100 kilometers an hour, and you couldn't see 10 meters in front of you. The wind had a sound nobody had heard before. Sheets of corrugated iron started peeling off roofs in the northern suburbs around 11, and by 11:30, glass was breaking in earnest. Out at sea, the eye was getting smaller and tighter, and inside that eye, the air pressure was dropping like a stone in a well. And in St. John's College, a Catholic priest called Father Ted Collins reached for his tape recorder and pressed the red button. What he captured over the next 30 minutes is now considered the most chilling audio document of any natural disaster in Australian history. You can hear it for yourself if you ever go to the Museum of the Northern Territory. They keep it in a dark booth and they warn people before they go in. It's not for everyone. Some survivors still can't listen to it. They don't need to. They lived inside it. Act 3. The night. The eye crossed the coast at around 3:30 in the morning. For the people in the northern suburbs, the worst had already started. In a house in Nakara, a 9-year-old boy called Rodney Gregg was being herded with his identical twin brother and the rest of his family of 7 into the family station wagon, which was parked under their stilted house. They got in 15 minutes before the upstairs caved in on top of where they had been sleeping. Rodney's father lost his shoes in the debris. Rodney would later step on a piece of corrugated iron and need a tetanus shot the next morning. He remembers, more than anything, the lightning. He says it was so bright it lit the whole street up like daytime. And he remembers the noise the iron sheets made as they scraped across the roads. A high, scraping, shrieking sound, like millions of fingernails being dragged across a million blackboards all at once. In Ludmilla, an 11-year-old Arrernte girl called Christine Ross was crammed under a neighbour's billiards table with 24 other people. The men of the family were taking it in turns to hold the doors shut against the wind, because if the doors blew in, the debris would come with them, and the debris was killing people. Sheets of fibro were flying through the dark. Pieces of timber with nails sticking out were embedding themselves in walls and trees and, sometimes, in flesh. In Larrakia, a young first-year doctor called Stephen Baddeley had walked over to the casualty department of Darwin Hospital at about 11 o'clock with 2 bottles of champagne, expecting a quiet shift. By midnight, he was the only doctor on duty and the casualty department was filling up. By dawn, he would have worked 24 hours straight and he would never forget what he saw. Bodies stacked along the walls because there was nowhere else to put them. A dead infant placed on top of the pile. The senior anaesthetist, who had been trying to walk to the hospital from his house down the street, had been struck by a sheet of corrugated iron, which had nearly taken his head off. In their bathroom in the northern suburbs, the family, the survivor accounts called Julie and Heike, were crammed around the base of the toilet, with their 2-year-old son Brendan wedged between Julie's legs and a mattress pulled over the top of them. Heike was holding the bathroom door shut with his back. Then a piece of timber came straight through the wood and hit him in the back of the head. Julie pulled him into the room with her and felt the back of his head, and her hand came away wet, and she felt the wound, and she said later that she could put her whole hand into it. Then the wall between the toilet and the kitchen disappeared, just disappeared. And the fridge that had been backing onto that wall lifted into the air and flew across the backyard. And Julie, watching it go, thought to herself with absolute clarity, "We are going to die now." She has said in interviews since that her 2-year-old Brendan did not make a sound the entire night. Not one cry, not one whimper. He just held on. The wind was hitting 217 kilometers an hour by then. We know that figure exactly because the anemometer at Darwin Airport recorded it at 3:05 a.m. We don't know what it hit after that because at 3:10 a.m., the gusts bent the anemometer's needle in half. The Bureau later estimated the true peak gusts at somewhere between 240 and 260 kilometers an hour. Some analyses have put it higher. The truth is nobody knows, because the instrument that was meant to measure it was destroyed by the thing it was measuring. Down at Stokes Hill Power Station on the harbour, the lights had been off for hours. Shortly after 3:30, the plant shut down for good. The whole city went dark. And then the eye arrived. For about 35 minutes, the wind stopped. People who survived Tracy talk about the eye more than they talk about anything else. The wind stopped, and the rain stopped, and the noise stopped, and a lot of people thought the cyclone was over. Some of them stepped outside. They stood in their pajamas, barefoot in the wreckage, and looked up and saw stars. The only sound was water dripping from what was left of their roofs. Gail Hannon, the Canadian girl, remembers a child's voice asking, "Is it all over, Mum?" And then she says, the silence got louder, because they realized they were inside it, not past it. They were standing in the calm center of something that was about to come back from the other direction. And when it came back, it would come back stronger because the houses were already weakened. And the wind would now be hitting them on the side that the wind had not been hitting before. Down at Francis Bay, a Navy patrol boat called HMAS Arrow had been moored to a buoy in the harbour. Her captain, Lieutenant Bob Dagworthy, had been trying to keep her in place since dusk. Her engines had been running flat out, and they were starting to overheat. Around 2:45 in the morning, Arrow snapped her mooring. Dagworthy made the call to try to beach her in shallower water. He couldn't see anything. The salt spray was so violent he later said it felt like it would damage his eyeballs. At about 3:45 in the howling dark, Arrow was driven bow first into the concrete pilings of Stokes Hill Wharf. Dagworthy gave the order to abandon ship. Most of his crew got off. 2 didn't. Petty Officer Leslie Catton, 32 years old, and able seaman Ian Rennie, 21 years old, went down with the boat. There are streets in Darwin now called Catton Court and Rennie Road. The bar at the Navy base is called the Arrow Bar. Lieutenant Dagworthy has said, in interviews ever since, that not a day goes by when he doesn't think about those 2 boys. They were his mates. The eye passed, the back wall hit, and whatever was still standing in Darwin started to come apart. Act 4. The Things That Flew. Between 4 and 6:30 in the morning, the second half of the cyclone destroyed what the first half had only damaged. This is the part of the story that survivors tell with the longest pauses. A woman called Joan Aldridge, the Vice President of the Northern Territory Red Cross, was huddled under her kitchen table with 2 other adults, 6 children, 1 cat, 4 kittens, 1 dog, and 3 birds. The water pouring through what was left of her ceiling was, in her words, icy cold. All she had on was her nightie. The house came down around them, plank by plank, and she said later that she thought the cold was going to kill them before the wind did. A senior anaesthetist, trying to reach Darwin Hospital, was hit by flying corrugated iron. A boat at HMAS Arrow, an aluminium 15-footer, was lifted clean out of the water and thrown over the head of a junior officer who was watching it go. A loaded Indonesian DC-3 aircraft, anchored to the tarmac by multiple 44-gallon drums full of concrete, was picked up bodily and thrown over a hangar at Darwin Airport. Cars were stacked on top of each other in driveways. Power poles were wrapped in sheet metal until they looked like silver lollipops. In a house in Casuarina, a family who had taken shelter in the bathroom emerged at dawn to find that their bathroom was the only room left. The rest of the house was scattered down the road. A neighbour's car was sitting in their living room, except there was no living room, just the slab. A piano had ended up 2 streets over, on top of a child's tricycle, with the lid open and the keys still in a perfect row. A woman called Louisa Fanny Butler, 63 years old, had gone outside during a lull to chase her dog. She is one of the 66 confirmed dead. The exact circumstances of her death are still in dispute, but the documentation is brutal. Out in the harbour, the schooner MV Buya broke its moorings and was lost with all hands. Captain Terence Westwood, 63 years old, 3 of his crew, and a passenger called Ruth Vincent, 24, all went down with her. Buya wasn't found again until 2003. The little ferry Darwin Princess vanished. Her skipper, Raymond Curtin, 28 years old, of 4 Playford Street, Fanny Bay, was never seen again. 7 Japanese-Australian fishermen working for the Golan-Kyu Kuyo Company died on 3 steel trawlers. Their names are now on a black granite tablet at Christchurch Cathedral. 4 members of a single Navy family, 2 wives and 2 children, were killed in their married quarters at HMAS Arrow. By 6:30 in the morning, the wind was easing. By 7, you could stand up in it. By 8:30, the rain had stopped, although the rain gauge had been destroyed 5 hours before, so nobody knows for sure how much fell. The Bureau's best guess is somewhere over 255 millimeters. Most of it came down in the hour either side of the eye. The sun came up. Act 5. Daybreak. What people remember more than anything is the silence. There were no birds, no insects, and not a single leaf on any tree because there were no trees, only stripped trunks. There was no power, no water, no telephone. There was no street because the street signs were gone, and the houses on either side of the street were gone, and the only way to know where you used to live was to find your concrete slab and recognize it by the way the cracks ran. A smell was already starting of mold and salt and rotting prawn from the freezers that had given up an hour into the storm. A young father walked out of what used to be his house in Nightcliff and turned in a full circle. Every house he could see was rubble, all the way to the horizon. Not damaged, but flattened to the slab. He told the ABC, years later, that for several long minutes he genuinely believed he and his family were the last people alive. Not just in Darwin, on Earth. Because if it had happened to all of them, he reasoned, why wouldn't it have happened to everyone? That feeling, that we were the only ones left feeling, is something almost every survivor describes. It's the line that comes up in oral history after oral history. We thought we were the only people left on Earth. People started walking, some of them in pajamas, most of them barefoot, because their shoes had blown away in the night, and they had no shoes that weren't full of broken glass. They stepped over corrugated iron and over splintered timber, and sometimes over each other. Strangers helped strangers. People who had never spoken to their neighbours pulled each other out from under collapsed walls. A man in Wagaman, who had spent years feuding with the family next door over a fence line, spent 6 hours that morning digging that family's grandmother out of her bedroom. Down at Stokes Hill Power Station, a 28-year-old engineer called Stephen Allen, who'd lost his own house in the night, was climbing through the wreckage of the plant trying to figure out what was salvageable. The answer turned out to be one generator. He and his colleagues would have it running again by Boxing Day, providing 350 kilowatts of power to a city that had lost everything, just enough to run a hospital. Up at the casualty department, Dr. Stephen Baddeley was finishing his 24th hour on shift. The hospital had received over 500 patients. 145 were seriously injured. About 650 had needed treatment for cuts, mostly from corrugated iron and glass, which Baddeley would later estimate accounted for 90% of the wounds he saw. There were bodies stacked along the corridors because the morgue was already full. He told an interviewer years afterwards that his clearest memory of that morning was a dead baby placed gently on top of the pile because there was nowhere else for it to go. At the Northern Territory News Building on Mitchell Street, the editor, Don Sanders, was looking at the wreckage of his printing press and trying to figure out how a daily newspaper produces a Boxing Day edition with no roof. The answer was, with help from the police. The team broke into a printing shop, lifted out a working press, carried it down into the basement of the Darwin police station, and produced a 2-page emergency edition, dated the 26th of December, 1974. They handed copies out at the airport and at refugee centres. People wept when they saw it. Not because of what it said, because of what it meant. The city wasn't dead. The city still had a paper. Out at the Bagot community, a Larrakia woman called Christine Fajo King was looking at country she had grown up on. She has spoken about that morning in beautiful, painful language. She said the trees were gone, the animals were gone, the insects were gone, the people were gone. And country, she said, was left in stillness. And stillness is a time to heal. Act 6. The world finds out. Here is the strange part. The rest of Australia didn't know. Cyclone Tracy had destroyed every long-range radio transmitter in the Northern Territory. The OTC station, the Navy transmitters at HMAS Melville and Coonawarra, the airport's communications, the telephone exchange, the ABC's transmission tower, the lot of it gone. As far as Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane were concerned, on Christmas morning of 1974, Darwin had simply gone silent. People turned on their wireless to hear the carols and assumed everything was fine. The acting Prime Minister, Dr. Jim Cairns, would not be told what had happened until 9 hours after landfall. The first communication out came from an amateur radio operator. Bob Hooper, the manager of the OTC station, was a ham operator in his spare time. Sometime around mid-morning, he managed to get a Morse code signal through to a colleague in Mooroolbark, on the eastern fringe of Melbourne, a pilot called David Fredrickson, whose Connellan Airways de Havilland Heron had survived because it was tied down to 350 kilos of beer cartons, used his aircraft's HF radio to relay messages to Katherine, 300 kilometres south. By midday, ABC reporter Dick Mutimer had managed to get a microwave message through to Mount Isa, and Mount Isa called Sydney, and Sydney called Canberra, and Canberra rang the lodge in Greece, where the Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, was midway through a 15-nation overseas tour. Whitlam was in Sicily when he got the call. He started flying back. It took him 3 days. On Christmas night, an RAAF BAC-111 jet landed at Darwin Airport on a runway lit only by car headlights and burning kerosene flares. Out of it stepped a 52-year-old Major General called Alan Stretton, the head of the Natural Disasters Organisation. Stretton was a soldier. He had served in 3 wars. He had been awoken in his Canberra bed by a phone call relayed from the Cyclone Warning Centre in Perth. And his first act, before he even put his trousers on, was to order 200,000 army rations, the largest single ration order Australia had placed since the Second World War. Stretton was given, by acting Prime Minister Cairns, what amounted to absolute authority over the city of Darwin. For the next 6 days, he was, effectively, a wartime dictator over an Australian capital. He set up command in a half-destroyed building. He convened 24 executive committees of local civilians, because his instinct was that the recovery had to be run by Darwin people, with the army in support, not the other way around. And he made the most consequential decision of all. He ordered a mass evacuation. 60% of the city had to leave. Now, down south that day, Mike Hayes of the ABC, a journalist who had gone to bed in his Darwin home on Christmas Eve and woken on the floor of a wrecked house on Christmas Day, finally got a phone line through to a colleague in Melbourne. He talked for 50 minutes in a flat, exhausted voice, describing what he had seen. The recording was broadcast that night across the world. There's a moment in it that has haunted Australians for 50 years. Mike Hayes pauses and his voice cracks slightly and he says, "This was once a bloody good place to live." That was when the country understood. Act 7, the evacuation. In the next 5.5 days, between the 26th of December and the 31st, the Australian Armed Forces and the country's airlines and a fleet of buses and private cars carried out the largest single evacuation of civilians in Australian peacetime history. 35,362 people, about 25,000 by air, about 7,000 by road. By New Year's Eve, the population of Darwin had dropped from about 47,000 to 10,638. Women and children went first, then the elderly, then the sick. Men in most cases were told to stay behind and help with the recovery. There are stories, often retold, of men trying to get on the planes in their wives' wigs and dresses. Police pulled them out of the queues. Some got through anyway. One Qantas flight on the 28th of December has gone into aviation history. A 747-238B with the registration VH-EBB, captained by Ken Nicholson, took off from Darwin with 673 evacuees on board, plus crew. 697 souls in a plane designed for 365. It still holds the world record. People sat on the floor, children sat on parents' laps, babies were passed to whichever lap had room. The plane took off into a clear blue Christmas week sky and headed for Sydney, and the people inside it cried and slept and held each other and didn't know any of the people they were holding. Down south, the country opened its doors. Adelaide River, a tiny town on the Stuart Highway south of Darwin with a population of a few hundred, fed every single refugee who came down the road on Boxing Day. Hot meals, water, petrol, they'd organised it themselves overnight. Alice Springs raised $105,000 for the recovery in 24 hours. About $665,000 in today's money, from a town of 14,000 people. The Salvation Army served 25,000 meals at Darwin Airport over 4 days. The Red Cross set up name boards at Red Cross House in Adelaide, where people who had escaped could have their names listed so that family members down south could find out, by squinting at a chalk-written list pinned to a wall, whether their parents had survived. Australians who weren't there did what Australians do. They cooked sausages, they held cake stalls. The Boxing Day test at the MCG between Australia and England had players from both teams walking the boundary with metal buckets, and people in the stands threw money in until the buckets were too heavy to carry. A Wellington duo called Bill and Boyd recorded a song called Santa Never Made It Into Darwin, which had been written by a man called Bill Cate, and released it in January. It went to number 2 on the charts and won the APRA Song of the Year for 1976. Every dollar went to Darwin. 49 years on, you can still hear it on the radio in Northern Australia every December. Act 8. The Cost. By the time Stretton handed the city back to civilian control on New Year's Eve, the numbers were starting to firm up. 66 people confirmed dead. The official figure has been revised over the years, from 49 to 65 to 71. And now back to 66 after a careful audit by the Museum of the Northern Territory in 2024. The plaques at the East Point Memorial, unveiled at the 50th anniversary, still bear 71 names. Both numbers are honest. The discrepancy is part of the story. 145 seriously injured, 650 in total who needed treatment. 837 million Australian dollars of damage in 1974 money, which is somewhere north of 7 billion in today's money. 70% of every building in the city damaged or destroyed. 80% of all houses uninhabitable. 94% of the housing stock so wrecked that you could not move into it as it stood. 41,000 people out of a population of 47,000 made homeless overnight. 31 aircraft destroyed at the airport. 25 more damaged. At least 29 boats sunk in the harbour. Most of the trees stripped of bark. Nearly all the dogs, in a controversial decision made for public health reasons that survivors still argue about, shot in the days after the storm by army and police patrols. Some people stayed in Darwin specifically to protect their pets. They lost the fight anyway. And then slowly, the rebuilding. The Whitlam government passed the Darwin Reconstruction Act on the 28th of February 1975 and appointed a commission, led by a man called Tony Powell, to put the city back together within 5 years. They got it done in a bit over 3. The new houses had tied-down roofs, cyclone-rated cladding, and structural designs that took horizontal wind loads seriously for the first time in Australian residential history. Those building codes were eventually adopted nationally. They are the reason Cyclone Larry in 2006 and Cyclone Yassi in 2011, both arguably stronger than Tracy, killed nobody by structural failure. Tracy taught the country how to build for the wind. The cost was 66 lives. By the middle of 1978, Darwin's population was back to where it had been on Christmas Eve 1974. About 60% of the original residents had come back. The rest never returned. Some of them said they couldn't face another wet season. Some of them said the ghosts were too thick. Some of them said nothing at all. They just stayed wherever the evacuation flight had set them down, and they made a new life there, and they didn't talk about it. Act 9, what it left behind. This is the bit that's hardest to talk about, because the cost of Cyclone Tracy isn't only in the figures, it's in the people who lived through it. A 50-year-old survivor called Robin Cooper Radke, who was 12 in 1974, has spoken in recent interviews about being diagnosed with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. She says she still flinches at the sound of certain wind gusts. She says she has spent her adult life in two halves, before Tracy and after. Half the survivors, when you talk to them, will tell you the same thing. PTSD wasn't even a clinical term in 1974. There was no debriefing for the kids who walked through the rubble. There was no counselling for the parents who carried their children out of the wreckage. People got on with it because that was the only thing on offer. And then decades later, they realised they hadn't actually gotten on with it at all. They had just put it in a box and pushed the box to the back of a cupboard, and the box had never stopped leaking. Australians of a certain age still split their lives into pre- and post-Tracy the way Americans split theirs around the 11th of September. They say things like, "That was just before Tracy tone," or "We'd been married a year by the time Tracy hit." It's a way of locating yourself in your own life. There's an audio recording in a sound booth at the Museum of the Northern Territory in Darwin. They keep it dark. They warn people before they go in. It's the tape Father Ted Collins made in his presbytery, with the wind getting louder and the glass breaking, and then, in the middle, those 35 long minutes where the eye passes over and you can hear Father Collins breathing, and the ticking of his clock and a sort of stunned stillness. And then the back wall of the cyclone hits, and the noise comes back from the other direction, and it goes on for another 2 hours, and it sounds nothing like wind. It sounds like a thing that wants you dead. You can stand in that booth in the museum for as long as you want. Most people don't last the whole tape. I'm not sure you should. A few weeks ago, I was reading the Survivor Archive, the CycloneTracy.au project, where they've been collecting first-person accounts for the 50th anniversary. There's a line in one of them I haven't been able to get out of my head. It's from a woman who was a teenager in Waggaman in 1974. She wrote, "We lost the house, we lost the dog, we lost the car, we lost most of what we owned. But on Christmas morning, my mum made my brother and me stand on the slab where the kitchen used to be, and she gave us each a tin of peaches she'd dug out of the rubble, and she said, 'You're alive. You're standing up. That's your Christmas.' That, more than anything, is what Tracy left behind. Not the building codes, not the death toll, not the Coriolis sculpture at Bundilla Beach or the 5 frangipanis at East Point, or the Boxing Day song that still plays every December. The thing Tracy left behind is the people who 50 years later can still tell you exactly what they were wearing when the roof came off, and exactly what their kids said in the bathroom at 3 in the morning, and exactly what the silence felt like when they walked outside at dawn and saw a city that wasn't there anymore. So that's Cyclone Tracy, the storm that killed 66 people, leveled an Australian capital and changed the way the entire continent builds its houses, the smallest cyclone in world history at the time it struck, and the one that did the most damage per kilometre of width that has ever been measured in the Southern Hemisphere, the Christmas that wasn't, the night Darwin died, and the months and years it spent crawling back to its feet. If you lived through it, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where were you that night? Whose house did you shelter in? Who came and got you out the next morning? What did your mum or your dad say to you when the sun came up? What's the smell or the sound or the small detail nobody else would think of, but you can't forget? The 50th anniversary has come and gone. The survivors are getting older, and these stories matter to the kids and the grandkids and the rest of the country. If you weren't there, but you grew up hearing about it, tell us that too. Tell us where you were when you first heard the word Tracy, and what your parents told you, and how it shaped what you thought about cyclones for the rest of your life. If this video brought it back for you, give it a like, share it with someone who remembers, and subscribe so we can keep telling these stories. There are more of them than we can fit in a lifetime, and we are losing the people who live them faster than we can write them down. Thanks for watching. Look after each other. And to everyone in Darwin, past and present, who still feels the wind pick up every December and goes very quiet for a moment, 50 years on, we're still thinking about you. Merry Christmas.